Today's focus of this lesson is looking at why did Australians go to World War One. During this lesson, I'm going to be taking you through a number of motivations for why Australians were so eager to enlist to fight in World War One, and as a part of that process, we're going to be looking at some primary source quotes from politicians, but also soldiers, and also get a look at a primary source image that sort of typifies the reaction Australians had to the outbreak of World War One. As you can see in front of you here, we have just a bit of a mind map here looking at why Australians went to World War One in such an eager fashion. And the big one I want to draw your attention to here is in the top right corner, is the connection to Britain, or as they called it back then, the motherland. Australia had just become a new nation in 1901 as part of Federation, but they still had a really strong connection and tie to their motherland, Britain, as they were still part of the Empire. We technically still are part of the Commonwealth to this day. Even though we were on the other side of the world, Australia saw themselves as a colony that was going to become a New England, a New Britain, and they were extremely proud of that. And this idea about being part of the Empire meant that when Britain was caught up in an international affair like a world war, Australia didn't think twice about it, but they were going to support their mother country, Britain. And so the connection to Britain, guys, is one huge factor that strongly influences Australians to enlist in World War One. Another more simple one, if we move around clockwise, is beyond proving oneself as a nation, because we'll come back to that, but over to the left-hand corner is looking at financial incentives. It's important that we just don't overlook this, because for some soldiers, it simply was a matter of employment. Irregardless of how they thought about Britain or adventure, or proving oneself, they just wanted to have a stable income for a certain amount of time. But if we do go to the top left, one really influential factor was this idea that war was seen as a glorious adventure. We can see that as understood as war innocence. If you want to give it a more modern understanding, is this idea of FOMO. These young men were fearful of missing out on what they saw war being, a glorious adventure where they're going to experience something new. They truly believed that this was never going to happen again. And war starting in July, August, they thought they were going to be back by Christmas. They were sorely mistaken. They were there for 4 years, and many of them lost their lives. Another big reason why war was seen as glorious and this big adventure is because there were no major wars before this time for Australians, apart from the Boer War, but it wasn't on a large scale. And so a lot of these young men growing up in a peaceful existence were innocent around the concept of war. And only had these glorious, I guess, innocent ideas of what war was going to be like. And the last big factor is this idea about proving oneself and one's nation. It's only 13 years earlier, that Australia becomes an independent nation. It becomes its own nation. And a lot of Australians want to prove themselves on the international scale. And this concept, guys, you can use if you're ever writing about this, is this notion of baptism of fire. That a country can't consider itself a modern country, a reasonably respectable country, unless it has gone through some form of war to prove itself. Which is hard to believe now, but that's how they felt. So if you ever get a question around why did Australians enlist into World War One, these are the 4 areas you need to be touching on. Glancing over financial incentives, but really touching on this big thing about connection to Britain. That's the big one. Another one about war being seen as a glorious adventure. Young men want to do that to the point where they actually forge their age. They lie about being underage. And another one is about proving oneself and one's nation. Now, to give you an idea of how eager the Australians were to join the war effort, we can see that in this image of Australian men lining up outside the enlistment office. This is a really, really clear image of the excitement and the enthusiasm a lot of men had towards the impending war. Now, if we move beyond that, we can see, if I can just find it for you, this is a primary source quote from Sir George Houston Reed in 1913. And this is what he says in regards to the British Empire. Ties of loyalty bind the empire and defend the flag which has always defended her. The British flag is the last line of defence against all forms of lawless conquest. And that shows you his connection to the British Empire. But it gets even more apparent when we see Prime Minister Joseph Cook in a speech in Victoria in 1914. So this is just after World War I's been announced. And he says, "Whatever happens, Australia is part of the empire right to the full. Remember that when the empire is at war, so is Australia at war. That being so, you will see how grave is the situation. So far as the defences go here and now in Australia, I want to make it quite clear that all our resources in Australia are in the empire and for the empire and for the preservation and security of the empire." End quote. Now, Prime Minister Joseph Cook makes it abundantly clear here, even if we just count the number of times empire is mentioned in this quote, that the British Empire is the most important factor to him as to why Australia is at war. But if we go beyond that, we look at Charles Bingham, who was actually a soldier, and he's interviewed in 1985. And he was saying there was a feeling that England was the mother country. We were only a colony anyway, and although we'd been given independence, we were so tied to Great Britain that when she was in trouble, it was just automatic, a feeling of, this is your duty. That's why I think the majority enlisted. Some out of loyalty, some searching for adventure, and some, I'm afraid, to get away from a cranky wife. It was automatic. Every man from the first day off was a volunteer. Some of them, they'd walk for 2 or 3 days. It was remarkable. It was a remarkable expression of loyalty. I doubt if it will ever happen again. And Charles Bingham really touches on something there, that this was a new phenomenon, World War One, something that no one had ever seen before. Hence why they're called the Great War. But Charles Bingham in that quote touches on the connection to Britain. Doesn't really touch on financial incentives, but he really touches on this idea that some were looking for an adventure.